So, speaking of the election, if you watched the presidential debate last night, and perhaps the previous two debates, amidst the din and the noise and the angry assertions, you may have heard several important issues raised about the ethics of war and peace. There was discussion of nuclear weapons, revolving around questions of modernization, proliferation, and first use. There was mention of the northern Iraqi city of Mosul, where Iraqi and coalition forces have just begun an offensive to retake the city from ISIS, which is using guerrilla tactics in an asymmetric conflict. And there was some debate about Hillary Clinton's proposal to create humanitarian corridors and safe zones protected by an American-enforced no-fly zone within Syria. All of this brought me back to my first lessons in the just war tradition as a student of Bryan Hehir's at Harvard Divinity School in the mid-1990s. At least since that time, in published work and in his lectures, he has argued that three contemporary developments present serious challenges to the prevailing norms of just war theory, namely nuclear weapons, asymmetric warfare deployed by terrorists, and humanitarian intervention. So he got it right then, he's still getting it right now. Indeed, each of these three things presents continuing challenges to different parts of the just war tradition. And I expect we'll hear more about these challenges and others in our conversation this evening. For those who are new to some of the jargon that will be used tonight, a very short primer might be of use. Just war theory is a tradition of moral reflection on the use of force that has roots in the Christian tradition, but in recent decades has become part of secular moral reasoning as well. It begins with the understanding that one can speak about morality in times of war, and that there is a moral presumption against the use of military force in a given context, unless certain conditions can be met to establish an exemption to that initial position. The first set of conditions must be met before going to war, and these are familiar to anyone who's witnessed the public debate in the United States about military intervention or other engagements in the past 25 years. They say that those who would wage war must have a just cause, a right intention, proper authority behind them, and a reasonable probability of success. We call these the jus ad bellum considerations. The second set of considerations concern the conduct of war, and they focus on proportionality and respect for non-combatant immunity. In other words, the protection of the innocent in times of conflict. And these we categorize as jus in bello considerations. And traditionally, these two sets of conditions are evaluated separately, which is to say that fighting a just war is not the same as fighting a war justly. We can be in conflict for just reasons, but fight it in an unjust manner, and vice versa. But arguments have been made that these sets of conditions ought to be more closely linked, and this may be a point of conversation tonight among us as well. Finally, I'd add that the just war paradigm is also frequently used as a framework by which we can evaluate other aspects of war and peace, including the aftermath of violent conflicts, which we call jus post bellum, or the use of certain technologies like drones or nuclear weapons. Just war theory isn't simply a tool for academic philosophers and theologians. On the contrary, it has become an important source of moral reflection for those in the military, those in policymaking roles as well. And it's come to be a part of the American political discourse about the use of our military around the world. So the themes of tonight's panel aren't merely hypothetical. They're not abstract theories that don't touch the ground. These are concepts that figure in our contemporary dialogue about our electoral process, about our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines around the world, and for all of us as citizens to think carefully about how we vote and how we should think about the use of American force around the world. And that's the reason why we've invited three extraordinarily distinguished scholars and practitioners to talk about this from three different approaches, although they share many things as well, as we'll be seeing. We have voices from a long military career, from a long diplomatic career, and a long academic theological career. All of them have intersected and intertwined over the past decades. I'm going to be introducing each speaker right before they speak, so your understanding is fresh. And our first speaker will be General Dubik. General James Dubik is professor of the practice and director of teaching at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. During his 37 years of active duty in the United States Army as an infantryman, paratrooper, and ranger, he commanded U.S. and multinational troops in Haiti, Bosnia, and Iraq during the surge in 2007 and 8, among other locations, retiring at the rank of Lieutenant General. General Dubik is also currently a senior fellow at the Institute for the Study of War and at the Institute of Land Warfare, and he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In 2012 and 2013, he held the Omar Bradley Chair of Strategic Leadership, a position co-sponsored by Dickinson College, Penn State Law School, and the U.S. Army War College. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Johns Hopkins University and is co-author of the book Envisioning Future Warfare. His new book, available for sale outside after the event is over, is titled Just War Reconsidered, Strategy, Ethics, and Theory. And General Dubik will be available to sign copies of the book following the event. Welcome, General Dubik.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks to the whole staff for your welcome. My friend Jeff Blossy is not here, so I want to embarrass him in his absence. His humility and generosity and leadership has been an inspiration to me and should be to anyone who knows him. So I want to thank him for what I know in the background was his role in this.
He'll be here any minute.
A couple of admin announcements. It was first, my career was 37 years, 4 months, and 3 days. Not that anybody was counting when I was getting out. And second, in the question and answer period, if I ask you to repeat the question, it's not any of your fault. I have a hearing deficiency that cannot be fixed with current technology of what do you call it? Yeah. Hearing aids. I just jumped out of one too many airplanes and around one too many explosions, one too many machine guns. That's the reason. So if I ask you to slow up or ask the question again, please humor me. Look, I have to say that I'm kind of surprised to be here to talk about this book. I'm kind of surprised at the book itself. When I graduated from college in 1971 with a degree in philosophy, I also got 2 alternatives for a commission in the Army, a reserve commission and a regular commission. The reserve commission was for 2 years, the regular Army commission was for 3. And I wasn't really sure I was going to like the Army. That's why I emphasized 37, 4, and 3. I wasn't sure I was going to like this. I'd been in the Catholic seminary for a year. And I was figuring, well, I'll do a tour in the Army to figure this out. So I went to my dad. I said, Dad, who's not a career soldier either, I said, what should I do? And he said, Jim, what's your degree in? I'm very proud. Philosophy. I said, roger that. And what job do you have? And I said, well, I don't have a job. And he said, I know. 3 years would be fine. And so that's how I ended up being a regular Army officer. Setting conditions to stay. And so here I am, like 45 years later, a PhD in philosophy, a retired general officer, and written this book. And I just have to say, when I do an about face and look at my life, I said, who would have thought this would have happened in 1971? Certainly not me, none of my brothers, none of my friends. Look, we've been waging war for about 15 years. And to put it kindly, put it mildly, we're not where anyone would have thought we would be in 2001. And notice that I said we were waging war, because there's a big difference between waging a war and fighting a war. I want to talk about that later on. At the tactical level, the war fighting level, we've done pretty well. Our soldiers, and I'm going to use soldiers tonight as shorthand for soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. I just don't want to say that every time I say soldiers. So I have in my mind all 4 sets, probably contractors and civilians too, I should put in that category. Thank you. Yeah, actually our soldiers have done well at the tactical level. They've fought well, they've adapted well. They've done everything that they've been asked to do. Again, whether these soldiers were Provincial Reconstruction Team members or combat infantrymen. But at the strategic war waging level, we've not done as well. At the tactical level, most everyone agrees, look, we made some mistakes, but you won almost every tactical engagement. No one's going to say that about the strategic level. And we've just not cloaked ourselves in excellence, so to speak, at the strategic level. The sad truth is we've been a decade and a half of war and we don't have much to show. We've had some successes, absolutely no doubt about that. There's been progress made 2 or 3 times. There's progress being made in Iraq now, but we've not been able to translate that progress into strategic success. Regardless of the price we paid in terms of lives or treasures or American credibility. And there are a whole bunch of studies going on, civilian, military studies as to why, but I wanted to look not at strategic reasons, I wanted to look at the moral dimension of this problem. The moral dimension of the conduct of war. So about 4 years ago, I was talking to my wife, always a good thing to do when you're a husband, and I was lamenting over this, and she said, to put a very fine point on it, hey, get on with it. You're an airborne ranger and infantryman. You've got a degree in philosophy. You're a retired general officer. Go back and finish your PhD and write the book yourself. So what can you say? There's no slack in my house. And I saluted and moved out to Johns Hopkins and did this. So this is the result. So what I didn't focus on just ad bellum, going to war. I didn't focus on just post bellum on purpose. I wanted to look just in bello, the conduct of war. And what I found is that the conduct of war has been, in my view anyway, deficient because it almost exclusively focuses on the tactical level of the conduct of war. What's a legitimate act of war? What's the combatant, non-combatant distinction? What's the principle of proportionality? How to figure out the principle of double effect and double intent and how it applies so that you have only the minimum and justified numbers of collateral damage. How to take due risk so that you offer due care to the innocent. These are all very well embedded in just on traditional, just in bello principles, and I've got really no beef with these. They're fundamentally correct. They apply, they're derived from a theory of rights, that all human beings have the right to life and liberty, and you as a combatant or a soldier, you lose your rights or have them significantly abridged, but the innocent never do, and so you have this tension between fighting, between winning and fighting well. If any of you have read Michael Walzer, this is all very well captured in his book, Just and Unjust War. Of course, you know, in application it gets a little squishy. There's no doubt about that, but the application is in fact, my view, well established in the laws of war, well established in the rules of engagement, and do govern soldier and leader behavior on the battlefield. And when they don't, we read about it, and then we take the corrective action. The problem with this approach, the problems with this approach are two. First, war doesn't equal fighting. Said another way, war is more than just fighting. And there's a rub. A war has to be waged, not just fought. And to wage a war involves 3 morally relevant activities. First, achieving sufficient coherency in war aims, strategies, policies, campaigns. Second, generating a sufficient organizational capacity, because leaders don't act except through organizations, to translate those initial decisions into action, and then watch the action to see the gap between what was desired and what was actually occurred, and adapt from that. And then third, to sustain legitimacy throughout the war, legitimacy in a sense of following the laws of war, in sustaining public support, and ensuring proper subordination of the military to civilian leaders. Traditional just war theory principles say almost nothing about these things. And these activities have moral consequences. When they're done well, the war goes well. When they're done poorly, the war is dragged out unnecessarily. The innocent are put at risk longer than necessary. The lives of soldiers, citizens who become soldiers are used poorly, maybe even wasted. And the life of the political community is at risk, even if not existentially. So these 3 war waging responsibilities are not just corporate responsibilities of people in certain positions, they have moral relevancy. In fact, it's even worse because there's a second mistake. Most theorists whether just war or civil military political theorists, draw this sharp line between political leaders and military leaders, between the going to war and the conduct of war. But in the real world, the more you read about war, the more you experience war, you see that this line just doesn't hold true in reality. Now, waging war is not simply a military responsibility. It's not the case that political leaders make the decision to go to war and military leaders execute the war. Nice in theory, not in reality. War is a shared responsibility among a set of civilian and political leaders. There's no doubt that senior political leaders have final decision authority. And in that sense, there's a hard line and is strongly role differentiated. But the process leading up to that decision, the substance and information, the integrity of the process, the fidelity of the substance, the execution of the decisions, the adaptation, these are shared civil and military responsibilities at the strategic level. So, as stated, the traditional just war theory just, in my view, didn't match the reality of war, and just war theory is supposed to be a practical morality. So, my view is the theory had to be expanded to match reality, and that's what the book was about. The first chapter identifies a little more in detail about the gap, but I illustrate the gap. I use Civil War as an example. I use chapter 2 to give more grist to the difference between waging war and fighting a war, how they're related, how they're different. Again, I use the Civil War. I use World War II and part of the Afghan and Iraqi War to help illustrate these war waging responsibilities as different from the war fighting responsibilities. I also, in the second chapter, talk about the moral value of soldiers' lives. And again, that's shorthand: soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, civilians, and contractors who are fighting these wars. The four relationships are: one, soldiers' relationship with innocent; the soldiers' relationship with each other; the soldiers' relationship with his or her leaders; and the soldiers who become citizens in their relationship with senior political and military leaders. You see, what I think, the more you look at this, is that soldiers are not mere instruments on the battlefield, and senior leaders, political and military, are not mere instruments in the Capitol. They're not there just to be used. And at each level, they retain rights, they are not lost. So the next couple of chapters, I look at the civil-military relationship, because that's really the nexus of the war-waging level. I use Peter Fever's book, Armed Servants, for one chapter, and Elliot Cohen's book, Supreme Command, for the other. I look at the principal agent theory. In fact, I think it's unable to provide much of a foundation for moral responsibility. Not that Peter tried to do this, he didn't, that was not his intent. But I searched it because it's such a dominant theory and wanted to see if it could. My conclusion is it's not, because his approach describes the civil-military relationship as a principal-agent relationship, an employer-employee relationship, where the employer is the principal and the political leaders, and the employee is the agent, the military leader. And I think when under close analysis, this is insufficient, because under such a paradigm, working is defined as doing exactly what you're told, the way you're told to do it. And the relationship is built on power, control, compliance, obedience, and punishment. And this is an insufficient depth of a relationship that is more likely to create a toxic work environment than an environment in which a kind of dialogue is necessary to wage war. Further, such an approach devalues, in my view, the lives of, again, the soldiers who are ultimately executing these decisions. In this chapter, I use the Vietnam War and some of our post 9/11 wars. I go into the next chapter with what I think is a much richer Unequal Dialogue of Elliot Cohen. I think there's a lot there. I like it, and I think it's founded very firmly on an understanding of what war is, and so the civil-military relationship necessary that he describes is one that will work in the reality of war. But as good as it is, and as accurate as it is in terms of defining it in dialogue as unequal, because civilian leaders have the final decision authority, he doesn't talk about the translation into execution. He doesn't talk about the way the dialogue is equal, and he doesn't talk about the breadth of the dialogues that have to take place. He just talks about the tip of the hierarchy. And I used Secretary Bob Gates' book to illustrate how deep and how wide these dialogues go. And I use some works from the corporate world to talk about execution and the importance of execution. And you know, again, he doesn't talk about the equality. Civil and military leaders are both necessary to wage war. The political perspective is necessary but insufficient. The military perspective is necessary but insufficient. Only together in dialogue do we get to a sufficient breadth of perspective and understanding to make those three war-waging responsibilities work. So the next two chapters, naturally I got to put my own 2 cents out there. So chapter 5 is lays out what I think the civil-military dialogue should look like. I describe it as a decision execution regime, not focused just on dialogue, but the dialogue has an output that is the most prudent decision possible given the information, the time, and the circumstance, and then the adaptation required from that. A relationship that is equal in the sense of both perspectives being necessary in making sure the initial decision is the highest quality as possible, the execution and the adaptation. And then last, I list, the last chapter, I list 5 principles that I would adduce should augment the principles of jus in bello at the tactical level. The first is the principle of dialogue. The second is final decision authority, where I highlight having the authority is one thing, using it well is something else. If you have a right to a final decision authority, you have an obligation to use it well. That kind of gets lost in the claim that senior civilians have the right to be wrong. My belief is no one has the right to be wrong with someone else's life. And waging war is about using lives, as uncomfortable as that is. You put at risk innocence, you use the lives of the citizens who become soldiers, and you put the life of the political community at risk. And when you use someone's life, you have no right to be wrong. You have an obligation to be as right as you can. So the next principle is on managerial competence, where I say to my fellow generals, great, good warfighting skills are not enough at the strategic level, and to my civilian peers, political reliability is not enough at the strategic level. You have to be able to run bureaucracies and enter into a dialogue. Next is the principle of legitimacy, and last, the principle of resignation. I believe that at the senior level, whether political or military leaders, there should be recognized principle of resignation, so that the seniors are on same par with soldiers and leaders on the battlefield. To be consistent, we hold them to be moral agents, not just instruments. Same is true in the Capitol. Second, to identify that all of us remain moral agents, regardless of the suit or the stars that we wear. When I got issued my stars, I didn't get a return envelope for a certificate of my moral agency to send back. You stay moral agents even though you're in a senior position. And last, to ensure that our country, in the decision-making, execution, and adaptation process, has every safeguard that it needs before we start wasting the lives of our citizens and the innocent and putting the community at risk. So there you have it. That was my book. I'll say now that, like I say at the end of the book, I know what I said is going to be found deficient, but my hope is that it'll begin a discussion on the strategic level and the moral dimension of the strategic level of the conduct of war and lift us out of merely the tactical level. I hope I've primed the pump for some questions and maybe even 4 or 5 people will buy the book at the end. So,
Thank you very much, General Dubik. I'd like to invite people who are back in the back to come grab a seat. We still have seats up front, and I hate to have you sit in the steps in the back. We'll pause for a moment while you guys come down.
You're a fire hazard.
That's true. You're a fire hazard in addition to being uncomfortable up there. So come find a good seat. Great. Okay. Thank you all. Our next speaker is Ambassador James Jeffrey. He's the Philip Solon's Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he focuses on U.S. diplomatic and military strategy in the Middle East, with an emphasis on Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. One of the nation's most senior diplomats, Ambassador Jeffrey has held a series of highly sensitive posts in Washington, D.C. and abroad. In addition to his service as U.S. Ambassador in Ankara and Baghdad, he has served as Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor in the George W. Bush administration, with a special focus on Iran. He previously served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the Department of State, where his responsibilities included leading the Iran policy team and coordinating public diplomacy. Earlier appointments included service as Senior Advisor on Iraq to the Secretary of State, Chargé d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission in Baghdad, Deputy Chief of Mission in Ankara, and Ambassador to Albania. A former infantry officer in the United States Army, Ambassador Jeffrey served in Germany and Vietnam from 1969 to 1976. He's written several important recent pieces about U.S. military engagement in the broader Middle East, including accounts of the proper approach to destroying ISIS's alleged claimed Islamic State. And I know you're a graduate of Northeastern University and BU as well, so it's a special honor to have convinced you to come to the Heights for the first time this evening. You should have come a long time ago, but welcome, Ambassador, to Boston College, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me tonight. My role tonight is to be the anti-Dubik, but this is really hard because, first of all, I love this guy. He's a battle buddy, both ROTC infantry officers, 69 and 71. It helps that I'm a senior, but anyway. But this is a wonderful book, and I'll tell you why it's wonderful in a few minutes, and then I'll tell you why it's a dangerous book from my standpoint, from many, many years of being involved as General Dubik with the consequences of governments and war. And it's ironic that I'm here in Boston doing this because my engagement in all of this started 50 years ago, right here in the 60s, when all of us as college students were traumatized and seized and absolutely mesmerized by the issues related to Vietnam, particularly the moral issues. And it split friendships, it split groups, although in my community, and particularly here in Boston, most people were on the anti-war side. I wasn't one of them. And I'm trying to pick my words carefully because I would wind up saying I was on the pro-war side, and I wasn't. I was as much against Vietnam as any of them. But you would have to imagine the environment, you know, war, what is it good for? And we say yes, Du Bois will say no. There's still a little bitterness in my mind about that. I mean, it's not playing out well. They miss that, but anyway. Okay. Yeah, come on, perk up. Anyway, and my problem was not that I disagreed with people that the war was mistaken, that the war was badly managed, that we were going to lose, or we were losing. I agreed with all of that. it was the idea that thus the war was immoral, and that the only moral position one could take vis-a-vis an immoral war was to oppose it. In practical terms, that meant evading the draft, or draft resistance. We had different verbs and descriptions depending upon which side you came on, but essentially violating or encouraging the violation of the law because you felt that doing so would be immoral. Now, at a certain point, I accepted the point that you should not do something if you're clear in a very, very specific way that it is immoral, leaving aside the fact that you should also bear the consequences of that, and that was a problem in that era. I wasn't sure that government decisions, unless they are truly evil in their intent, should be the subject of individual citizens, if these decisions were taken legally, to pass judgment on and decide whether they would follow the law as it pertains to that decision or not. Because that has all kinds of implications. And believe me, students and members of the audience, it's coming up right now in this election. It has all kinds of significance about what you're required to accept and do as citizens. So, that was that era. And I was so fascinated by this, and plus had some experiences in the Army, that I went into the Foreign Service and wound up being sent repeatedly into wars and military situations and other bad voodoo kind of situations, culminating in being in the Bush White House. And there, of all places, the Bush White House, I firmed up my belief that had been developing since the 1960s, that in fact, at least modern democratic states don't easily go to war. It's very hard for them to do. It's an unnatural act. All modern Enlightenment democratic states are products of the Enlightenment and the humanitarian and legal and reason-based way of looking at the world that basically looks at the deliberate taking of lives as something that is, if not immoral, but certainly highly questionable and unnatural, potentially very questionable. Secondly, practically, getting involved in wars gets you in trouble. It got Harry Truman in trouble in Korea. It certainly got LBJ in trouble in Vietnam. Not handling military affairs correctly, the assault on our embassy in Tehran and invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union arguably cost Carter his job. The biggest scandal in the Reagan administration was Iran-Contra, which was primarily about two conflicts, one in Lebanon, the other in Central America. The Republicans lost both the Senate and the House in 2006 because of Iraq. Arguably, candidate Hillary Clinton lost, and candidate John McCain lost in 2008 because they had supported the Iraq War, and the winner, Barack Obama, had not. And more recently, Secretary of State designee Susan Rice lost her job because she hadn't handled another quasi-military operation, the Benghazi attack, in a proper way. So dealing with this stuff is really ugly in political terms. Yet, we're faced with a conundrum. If there's one thing we go back to, and I heard this all the time in the 60s, I think you may have been old enough to hear it, and you probably were, and that is World War II, that was a moral war. I would have fought in that war. Well, sure, but let me tell you about World War II. 50 million people killed, 2 nuclear bombs dropped, whole populations and states swept aside. If that's a moral war, and I mean from moral terms it was, we got some problems on the practical consequences of getting involved in moral wars for survival. And the conclusion we took after World War II that leads to everything we've been exposed to and everything we're faced with is, we can't let this happen again, so what went wrong? And then we wound up with what I call the Abyssinia, Manchukuo, Sudetenland, Danzig phenomenon. And I'm picking the most obscure places that got aggressed against in the 1930s, and everybody sat there, at least in Western Europe and the United States, and applying one or another variant of just war theory, and applying it in some respects reasonably, said, hey, proportionality and costs, benefits, and interests. What do we care about these places? And the answer was we didn't do anything, a whole lot, because the people who were honing their skills, invading those places, and in a couple of places like Czechoslovakia, developing a hell of a lot of real military capability, then decided to take on bigger bites like Poland and Pearl Harbor, to use two Ps. So we have basically, if you want to sum up in one sentence, American and Western military geopolitical strategy since World War II is no more World War IIs, particularly with massive nuclear weapons. So let's nip these things in the bud through collective security, deterrence, containment, and if necessary, fighting, and also other pretty strange, out of the way, not very important seemingly places. Vietnam, Bosnia, Kosovo, Korea. I mean, they're right up there with Manchukuo and Abyssinia. And that's what we've been doing for all these years. Since World War II, only twice, after 9/11 and in the Cuban Missile Crisis, neither of which themselves generated major military actions, major military combat, I should say, were we really in a war of choice. All the rest, all of these other conflicts, have all been wars of choice. And it's really hard to do that. Yet, from my perspective, you have to take those choices despite all of the pressures against it. That's where I have a problem with General Dubik's book. He adds another level of complication to this with his criteria, which are wonderful criteria for taking decisions about what. Chapter 6, the chapter where he lays out how you coordinate the various interests and strategies and objectives and resources and everything, and then the organizational side, how you carry it out. You did it better than me. I mean, that's first-class management theory generally, and it's really first-class foreign policy and military decision-making at the highest levels. We need much more of it. When we did it right, as he points out in his book in '91, things go well. When you do it wrong, he has plenty of examples of that, things go badly. My problem is, he takes one additional step and he attaches a certain, and here it's a little complicated as it often is, and I won't get into the law of war in a lot more detail because I don't know enough about it, but we have a problem here between these terms. Law of war, just war. To quote you, just war is a question of practical morality, and to quote you again, no right to be wrong. You're getting a slippery slope between managerial incompetence and something that is not only a violation of law and morality, but because it involves killing of people, something that's really evil. And so my concern is, and we could get into this in more detail, but as you didn't go into it perhaps later, one of your justifications was the special responsibility that political leadership have to citizens who become soldiers. I don't like that idea. And I don't like that idea because it takes a certain group of citizens, and even though they're in uniform, they're still citizens, and gives them a higher priority than the citizenry as a whole. As the President, as the National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense, you're responsible for the entire American public. Right. Don't distinguish military people in a special sense. We have enough problems with the separation of military folks and everybody else in America, and I wouldn't want to see that. But my main problem is if you make it harder to use military force, you will get the situation you have in Syria today. And I'm not necessarily sure Barack Obama made the wrong decision. I think he did in 2013. But I'm not so sure he'd be making the wrong decision now, taking on the Russians. But I will say that there are huge consequences to hundreds of thousands of Syrians of him not taking that decision. And you have to look at the costs of not acting as well as the cost of acting. And the bias in all of this is weigh what happens if you act and you're wrong. And to add on to the practical and political consequences of that, moral that can slip into legal means you're never going to act. And if you're never going to act, people elsewhere are going to act in ways none of you are going to want. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our final speaker is Father Bryan Hehir. He's the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. A Catholic diocesan priest, he's also the Secretary for Healthcare and Social Services in the Archdiocese of Boston and a close advisor to Cardinal Sean O'Malley. Father Hehir's research and writing focus on ethics in foreign policy and on the role of religion in world politics and in American society. He's one of the world's foremost experts on just war theory and has a long history of engagement with policymakers in the United States government. Previously, he served on the staff of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he was lead author of the influential 1983 pastoral letter on war and peace entitled The Challenge of Peace. He has also served as president of Catholic Charities USA and on the faculties of Georgetown and Harvard University Divinity School, the latter of which he led as chair of the executive committee. Father Hehir has received many awards during his career, including a MacArthur Fellowship, the Laterry Medal from Notre Dame, and in a few weeks, the 2016 Martin Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion from the American Academy of Religion. A friend of the Boise Center since its inception and a former teacher of mine, Father Hehir is always welcome here, and it's a pleasure to have you back at Boston College.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to come to Boston College, which fortunately I get a chance to do, and to come to the Boise Center, double pleasure. It's also a pleasure to share the platform with two practitioners of politics, military, and diplomacy. A famous Jesuit, probably the author of probably the most cited Catholic article on war and peace in the late 20th century, Father John Courtney Murray once said, if you're going to do the ethics of war or the ethics of anything else, you have to start first with the questions of fact. And if you can't master the questions of fact, you will not bring the questions of morality to bear upon them skillfully. So tonight on the panel you have heard from two practitioners already, including Jim Dubik, who has married his 37 years of practical engagement with war and peace now into the normative discourse of the book. So on all counts, it is a pleasure to be with them. I thought what I might usefully do, because the title of our evening is Just War Revisited, and in fact this is a moral theory that is now over 1,500 years old. So it has been revisited many times. And I thought I might helpfully get at that question of what it means to revisit it by doing what I will call a synthetic overview of the meaning of this just war tradition. I would love then to get to the practical issues that my two colleagues have raised, because that is what a moral theory is for, is to engage the practical issues. But a synthetic view of what this moral theory is. I like to state the question that this ethic is designed to address this way. War is multidimensional and has multiple parts, as Jim Dubik has highlighted, and they're not all military. But at the heart of going to war, it involves the large-scale, systematic, conscious participation, planning, and execution of the taking of human life. So at the core of it, that's what makes the moral question of war a hard case. So how do you answer that question? Well, this theory, I would argue, is a religiously based moral theory. It was given philosophical systematization in the Middle Ages, and then in the beginning of the era of the modern state, 16th, 17th century, it was incorporated in international law. So now, today, you have two different moral visions to look at war and peace. You have the moral theory of just war, and you have the legal theory of the laws of war, international law. Today, moreover, this theory can be seen as a moral product, as a religious product, because it's been rooted in a religious tradition. It can be seen as a moral theory without reference to its religious origins. And I would argue one of the characteristics of the just war theory is today it's public property. That is to say, people use it without reference to religious roots, and they may use it without some of the philosophical systematization it has received in the Catholic tradition. It is public property. It is used in the military schools of senior service in this country. It's used in academic life by political scientists and strategists. It's used in multiple ways. So it remains religious in its roots and can be used that way. It can be developed in a moral argument without religious reference. People differ about whether that will keep the theory true to its original design, but that's an argument that can happen. And it is used in the public arena of politics and law and military policy. The tradition moved through multiple political systems. It began in the Roman Empire. It continued on into the Middle Ages. It changed when it came to the sovereign state. Once states assumed sovereignty, which means they acknowledged no higher authority, either religious or political. Once states did that, then the architects of this doctrine in the 16th and 18th century began to concentrate on what Jim Dubik talked about, the fighting of war, rather than the argument about when you could go to war. The total theory always asked both questions, but there was a sense by the 18th century it was going to be harder to maintain the question of when sovereign states would go to war, and so therefore there was a lot of concentration placed on how you humanize the conduct of war once it had begun. The utility of this theory, I would argue, is based on a reading of three facts, if you will. First, a reading of human nature. The theory always acknowledged what you might call a moderate realist view of human nature, which is to say we are not totally corrupted as human beings, but we're not the optimistic Enlightenment person either. We are people capable of doing good, and we are capable of doing harm, and in a world in which many people and states can do harm, you may well need a moral theory that says some uses of force are morally acceptable, but not all uses of force are morally acceptable. So the theory begins with a reading of human nature. It secondly begins with a reading of world politics. A classic book in American political science is Ken Waltz's book, Man, the State, and War, in which Waltz says, where does war come from? He said, some people believe it comes from the kind of people we are, human nature. Some people believe it comes from the kind of regimes in which we live. Do democratic regimes fight less wars than authoritarian regimes? And then thirdly, Waltz argues, it comes from the nature of international politics. A decentralized political system made up of sovereign states, which even under the UN Charter, which is a political legal document, not a moral document, but even under the Charter, states have the possibility of using force, even though they should abide by the Charter. So a reading of human nature, a reading of the nature of the international system, and thirdly, a reading of history is a reason why this theory maintains its viability. For a reading of history tends to confirm that we're a world of imperfect beings, imperfect states, and if fighting is going to occur, It is better that it should occur within some stricture of restraint, limitation, and the ability to castigate evil when it occurs, than to simply say, once you move into the realm of war, there is no restraint, no restriction, and no judgments about right and wrong. The theory itself in the 20th century underwent a serious decline, I would argue, in the first 50 years of the 20th century. Indeed, I think, Ambassador, in the 1930s, there were a lot of reasons for ignoring the questions you raised. I don't think the just war was one of them. I don't think it was very much part of the debate. I don't think you found it as part of the debate in World War I, and you didn't find it as part of the debate in World War II. If Murray was the most quoted article in the second half of the 20th century, another Jesuit, Father John Ford, is the most quoted article in Catholic moral theology, I think. And that is a critique of the obliteration bombing of World War II. It was done without restraint on all sides. It was not criticized by virtually anyone. And in his book on the political history of the nuclear age, McGeorge Bundy, who was close to these issues, argued when the time came to make the decision about the dropping of the atomic bomb, no one in the upper reaches of the American government said, we don't bomb cities. And he said the reason no one raised that question was that question had been settled long before in World War II. So if you live in an imperfect world where force may be used, the need for a structured theory that imposes restraints is absolutely necessary. Today, in the world we live in, the complexity of the international system is maybe less dangerous than the Cold War in its ultimate possibilities. The ultimate possibilities of the Cold War were destruction of human life, period. Today, it's a more complex world. This international system can produce three different kinds of war. Interstate war, the classical kind. Internal conflict, which then invokes the question of humanitarian military intervention. And then thirdly, terrorist action by non-state actors. Those are three distinct political strategic challenges that the just war ethic, or any ethic on the use of force, must address. So what is the adequacy of the theory? Well, in fact, just war is being revisited on multiple fronts these days. It's addressed from a political strategic point of view about whether it's capable of dealing with those three kinds of the uses of force. But within the moral world itself, or the religious moral world, there are multiple debates. There is the standard model of just war, which I guess I'm trying to represent, which says a moral theory that says that some uses of force are morally acceptable, but not all uses of force are morally acceptable, is the most adequate moral answer to the world as we know it. There is, within Catholicism today, a much stronger voice on what one might call the pacifist, nonviolent tradition regarding war, much stronger than it was in the past. So you have an internal debate about the nature of the appropriate moral theory for the world in which we live. There's a different debate that goes on basically outside Catholic circles, I think. It is what is today called the revisionist critique of just war. It is carried on mainly by moral philosophers. Jeff McMahon from Oxford is probably the most prominently known. As I've seen it, I don't frankly think I fully understand it, and I say that because what I've seen so far I don't like. So maybe it's because I don't understand it, so I need to spend a little more time thinking about that. But that's a different debate. And then finally, there is the discussion of, even if you accept the idea that the just war is both needed and viable in our own tradition, there are other concepts that are about war and peace that aren't a discussion of whether you're pacifist or just war. You can be either one and be involved in what's today called peace building, the activity of preventive diplomacy, the activity of seeking reconciliation in internal conflicts. at the activity of dealing with the consequences of war after the fighting has stopped. That's a whole different set of questions that the theoretical debate on pacifism and just war both can support that. These are the kinds of revisitations that go on in the just war today, and it is, again, 1,500 years old, viable, complicated, and fragile in the world in which we live. But it may be the best we've got for the present minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Hehir, very much. There's seats down here, Jeff and others, if you'd like to come down. I think that one of the core things we insist on here is the time to interact with the audience, but there's been a few comments about General Dubik's book. You may want to, would you like to say a word or two briefly, and then we'll go out to the audience for conversation?
Well, I'll start with saying that there's an old saw that copying is the best source of flattery, or whatever the word is. But
Imitation.
I think, what is it?
Imitation.
Imitation,
flattery.
yeah. But I think, in terms of forums like this, is criticism is the best form of flattery, because without criticism, an idea doesn't get fleshed out. So I really appreciate, Jim, your comments there at the end. And to some degree, I agree with you. There's some dangerous things in this book. You only mentioned two. I'm going to lay out the third. The first is your business about managerial competence. I think waging war, the strategic level, the activities that I laid out, do demand managerial competence. I mean, no bones about that. But when you're using lives, it's not just managerial competence. If I was working at Kmart and moving widgets in an efficient way from one place to the other to get maximum stuff on the shelf to sell it fast, maybe there's less of a moral component, but I'm not doing that. I'm risking lives, I'm using lives necessarily in the enterprise that I'm in. So I think there's a legitimate comment to make. Maybe I don't get it right. I'm willing to accept that this is more than managerial competence. And the part of this is that as soldiers, you and I pretty much lost our rights vis-a-vis the enemy, that's for sure, in terms of our right to life. We didn't lose them entirely vis-a-vis our chain of command. Our chain of command had some responsibility. And I coined the word citizens, now soldiers, to highlight the fact that soldiers were also citizens. Not that they were some special class of citizens, but they were citizens. And vis-a-vis the government has responsibility to those citizens to use their lives as best possible. So that's how I came at that, and how I arrived at the conclusion. The second part of this, with respect to the right to be wrong, we all have seen that there are very few people at the strategic level of the military or civilian that you would call evil. I don't know any of them, to tell you the truth. These are good people trying to figure out the best thing to do given the time, the resources, and the difficulty, the information they have. So while I do in the book highlight some ungood examples, I'm also willing to say that these were people wrestling with some very hard problems. What I come down with is when you're wrestling with those, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make errors. Your judgment is not always going to be accurate. And we ought to allow that. But I had a real hard time as I was thinking this through with the term right to be wrong. I'm okay with I made a mistake. I'm okay with there was error in my judgment because I didn't understand the facts, or the facts weren't there to be understood. I mean, all these decisions are made in conditions of ambiguity, uncertainty, limited information, limited time. So the fact that I made an error in my judgment, could well be because the facts weren't there to make it a better judgment. But to claim a right to be wrong is, I think, to overstep the recognition that as a senior decision maker, military or civilian, your right is to make a final decision, which entails an obligation to be as right as possible. That's a little different configuration than a right to be wrong. The one dangerous part you didn't talk about, which I'm going to lay out there, is the principled resignation. This is the
Yeah.
this can
Covered in
have
the book, though.
dangerous consequences.
What, could you repeat that last part?
The principled resignation, principled resignation. This is the resignation of a senior military or political leader for matters of principle, which I claim ought to be acknowledged at the strategic level. Now, how this plays out in real life, though, could well end up challenging civil control of the military. And I try to walk this line in the book to acknowledge that we are all moral agents, even at the senior level, but that moral agency has to be exercised within limits. And if you exercise it in such a way that it threatens civil control of the military, you're beyond that, you're beyond the limit. So this is, I want to have it both ways. I know that in the book. So I think there's still some room to argue and to flush this part out. But I think it's right to say to our senior leaders, you must exercise your voice before a decision is made as powerfully as you possibly can. And in that environment, rare will be the case that someone will have to resign. This was the case of the relationship of Marshall to FDR. They had such a tumultuous set of discussions that, some of them, you might get fired having them nowadays. But because their voices were so heard, where Marshall always recognized that the president had final decision authority, even to say to Marshall, you're not invading Europe in 1942, you're not ready, go to North Africa and have a good day. Marshall saluted him correctly and went on, because they argued this out. It's the absence of the argument that increases the probability that principled resignation comes to the fore. So in bringing this principle out, I wanted to do as much as to highlight, A, we're all moral agents, B, this principle has limits, and C, it will not come up if the dialogue occurs correctly. So you didn't bring up that dangerous one, so I thought I'd do it on your behalf.
Because the book did such a good job of spelling out, because you laid it out, and it got a lot of play in the kind of community we're in, the right of resignation. But then you having your summation right now is covered in much more detail in the book, so I didn't want to repeat it. I only have 15 minutes. Give me a break.
I have lots of questions too, but I'll have time later, and I want to make sure that the audience gets as many questions as possible in. So please, when you raise your hand and say your name and your affiliation, the floor is open. Yes, sir, in the back.
Hi there, my name is Zach Huffman. I'm a sophomore in the political science and history departments here. And my question, thank you. My question is, what exactly is the process an entity goes through to declare a war as just? And if an entity has the high ground to declare something is morally just, what's to prevent them from becoming a moral authority and then telling other countries how they or other entities what is just? Because I see, after the Cold War, we saw the U.S. sort of become a police force for the world. Lots of folks opposed the large military presence of the United States throughout the world. But if we were able to say once we were right, what's to prevent us from saying in the future that we're right again, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it's debated. The moral aspects of any decision, along with the practical ones, will be debated certainly in the U.S. administrations I've seen. And then there is they're hanging over all of this. There is the jus ad bellum. There is the idea that there is a inherent justification for taking military action. And that, and people are more or less familiar in the superficial way that anybody in government is familiar with anything that is detailed and specific and academic, of the requirements of that. And hanging over that is Nuremberg. To the extent that there is something that is in the minds of policymakers, it is that leaders were found guilty of crimes, of war crimes, for unleashing military action without a moral basis for doing that. And that, combined with the tremendous concern that every leader has, and that was cited in your book too. I think it was a quote from George W. Bush of how hard it is to take these decisions. That sort of forms a framework within which they will do these things. But again, the other thing out there, and it varies from administration to administration and from time to time, is the idea of what if we do not act? You can't understand some of the dumb decisions taken by the Bush administration, which are outlined, Bush 43, outlined in this book, without understanding not just 9/11, but the fact that the basic feeling was that the prior administration, the Clinton administration, did not act against Al-Qaeda. Ironically, Clinton acted against Milosevic twice. He acted against Saddam Hussein repeatedly. He acted against the Chinese in the Taiwan Straits. It wasn't that he was averse to using military force, but the one thing that he didn't decide was worthy of using military force on, or that the calculation, be it moral, and some of it was moral, led to 9/11. So that's the thing that's also in the back of all these people's minds is, what happens if I don't act? What will history say about me?
Yeah, Bryan.
It may be useful to bring this back to the theory. One of the characteristics of just war theory is it has two audiences. It's meant to be a public policy ethic. Again, Murray stated it best. He said the function of just war is to set the right terms for public debate about the use of force. Now that means that the government's involved in deciding what's right and wrong, but the public is involved in deciding what's right and wrong. And the public can be broken down into specialists and common citizens. And if we all were old enough to remember Vietnam, as Ambassador Jeffrey said, there was a certain point in that war in which the government could say forever it was acting justly and it had lost the ability to convince the American public. Whether that was right or wrong, you can look at, but it had lost the ability. So the point is, the government can make its case, and forcing it to make its case is a good thing. So the first function of just war is to set up public debate. Government, citizenry, specialists, political, military. The second function of just war is to provide a framework for personal conscience. So this is Jim's point about resignation. That's appropriate to this theory. It's appropriate that if you're a citizen, if you're a soldier, if you're an ambassador, or if you're president or congressman, and you oppose the going to war, and you lost the argument, you still have the ability to say to the state, I will not serve. You still have the ability to, now you may take the consequences for that, but you have the ability to say, I will not serve. You withdraw loyalty to the state on this question, maybe not every question. So that raises the question of resignation. And resignation fits into this framework because you are given the capacity to make an argument against the state if you are convinced that the state has gone wrong and is asking you to support the action or to enforce it or to apply it. And it does. And the final point about this is the complexity of the American legal system. In the American legal system, if you hold the just war and the state goes to war and you say you're doing the right thing, I'll serve. That's simple. if you think the state's gone wrong and you go in and say, I'm an absolute pacifist, the legal system will grant you protection and you go about your way. But if you go in and say, Jim's point, that I'm not a pacifist, this war is wrong. That's called selective conscientious objection. It is the primary possible conclusion of just war theory. Not that I'm opposed to all war, but I'm opposed to this war. Even I'm opposed to this weapon system. And I'm talking too long, I'll give you one more example. I've asked this of students I've had at Kennedy School, Air Force students and others. In the 1980s, when the debate on nuclear weapons got very intense, one of the things the Air Force did was that in addition to the fact that someone who is pledged to defend the Constitution and support the Commander-in-Chief, so presumptively is ready to follow orders, the Air Force instituted another step, and that is if you were going to be located in a missile silo, an ICBM silo of nuclear weapons, you had to sign a piece of paper saying you did not oppose the use of nuclear weapons. That was an added step, and it was remarkable that it was taken because it got you into this very thing. Again and again, I doubted that that happened, but again and again I've been told it absolutely happened.
Yeah. Can we take another question? Or do you
Yeah,
want
no,
okay.
let's go to that.
Yes, this in the back, yeah.
Hi, Jake. Is this on? Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. We need to not only look at the domestic legal system, we need to look at the international legal system as well, because this problem with sovereignty keeps coming up. The United States refuses to join the International Criminal Court. It refuses to recognize the decisions of the International Court of Justice. It refuses to subject its own foreign nationals to war crimes tribunals or to universal jurisdiction. One of the reasons why we didn't renew the agreement with Iraq was because the United States didn't want its own personnel subjected to Iraqi courts or Iraqi domestic law. So if we're going to have moral decision-making in just war, we can't just rely on resignations, can we? We also have to be accountable to independent international adjudicatory bodies which aren't subject to a nation's power or a nation's role or status within the international framework of force and violence.
Right.
It's something that they will obey regardless of their relative strength.
Thank you, great question. Anybody like to take it? Bryan, you want to start?
Well, sovereignty is an organizing principle of international politics. So sovereignty is not going away. Sovereignty is not an absolute principle. That is to say that no restrictions can be placed on it or no restrictions ought to be placed on it. International law does place restrictions on sovereignty, some. Just war places maybe stronger restrictions. Just war recognizes sovereignty as a valid principle of organization, but not an absolute principle. Now, the cases you've raised are cases where the increasing web of international limitations on sovereignty has grown in the last third of the 20th century and on till today. Now, when you make those limitations, or when you make those laws, then you've got to convince sovereign states to participate, because that's the nature of sovereignty. The UN is made up of sovereign states. So, sovereign states hopefully will cooperate with reasonable limitations, and I think the International Criminal Court is a reasonable limitation. And I think it is unfortunate that we don't participate. But don't be surprised if states don't participate, because they withhold the right to do that in a still disorganized international system.
Yeah, if I could jump in, partially because I'm going to disagree with you for a second, Reverend. Okay. You've mixed, understandably, because you were very persuasive, but still you mixed apples, oranges, and bananas. The apple is the International Court of Justice. That is an accepted venue that is anchored in international law, including American treaty law. And the cases that I know of where we did not go along with decisions against us are legitimate criticisms of the United States in the area of international law. There's some technical issues related to it, but it's a legitimate criticism. The ICC is not. Whether you like the ICC or not, and it's very high on my list of things I really detest, we're not a member of the ICC. And by the nature of things, if you're not a member of an international treaty, you're not required to abide by it. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on why I dislike the ICC, but it starts with the fact that most countries that we're liable to ever be in a war with, not to speak of all of the non-governmental, non-state actors we're liable to be in conflicts with, don't adhere to it. And then the third thing, the Iraq thing, is I was the guy who actually negotiated that. That is a common standard that not only the United States, but essentially all NATO and other countries do when they deploy troops in another country, is in return for doing this, which is to the benefit of the country, you ask that your personnel have the same immunities that I, as a diplomat, routinely got thanks to the Vienna Conventions of 200 years ago. So I don't see that as a criticism per se of the United States, because it's a common international thing that's commonly accepted, that military personnel are exempt from local jurisdiction.
General Dubik, do you want to?
No, not just U.S. I mean, when I commanded multinational forces.
Yeah, the NATO people wanted, they all wanted it too, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And outside of NATO, when I was in Haiti and had Argentines, it was the same respect.
Yeah.
So.
Great, another question from students, yes.
Father, you brought up some issues.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, sorry, William Packwood. I'm a sophomore in the management school here. Father, you brought up some issues about examples of times when clearly the moral issues that you had been discussing were not respected throughout the past. My question would be, perhaps on a historical scale and looking forward, do you think that we're adhering more to these theories than we were in the past? And do you think in some ways, or are you perhaps worried that these are standards that we're willing to disregard in times of extreme stress, such as the examples that you brought up?
Well, I think it, when you ask more or less, it may depend on the time frame you use. I mean, obviously, if you go back to the Middle Ages, there was a sense that there were multiple authorities over any political authority, you know, and the Holy Roman Emperor, which Voltaire said was neither holy nor Roman nor an emperor, but it was still there. And then the Pope those were the two twin superior authorities. What sovereignty meant was a rejection of both of them, religious and political, and that arises within the 16th to 18th century. Now, let's use the 20th century. In the 20th century, if you simply use World War II, as I said, obliteration bombing, which violates non-combatant immunity, Jim would play that out in detail, no one doubts that. That was carried out on both sides all the time, and there was virtually no critique of it. The standard article by John Ford that I mentioned was published in 1944, and it received virtually no attention then. It's received a lot of attention since then, but that's a good example. I think human rights laws that have come into play since 1948, which then can be joined with the longer, larger tradition of the laws of war, begin to create a web of questions that you use whenever force can be used. In a democracy, I think there's a special responsibility for the citizens of a democracy to raise those questions, because people in non-democratic regimes may not have the chance to do so. So I think it looks better than World War II. In World War I, my sense is that there was virtually no significant moral restraint, either advised or followed from. But it wasn't primarily civilian casualties either, so it was different than World War II. You can crucify World War I as disproportionate. You can crucify it as stupid in terms of it happening and in terms of it continuing in trench warfare over months and months. But there wasn't that kind of debate. Today, I don't think a democracy can go to war without justifying its case, particularly on civilian casualties. And that doesn't mean that will always create good policy, good meaning right, but a government will have to contend with that, whether they eventually win or lose the case.
Can I answer your question in a different angle than you asked it? From a non-historical but a personal side? Not me personally, but as an individual. Michael Walzer in Just and Unjust Wars begins his book, at least the 1977 version, with his discussion about how ethics was taught to him as a student. And his claim was he was taught, and he's out of this mode now, he was out of the mode a long time, he was taught that ethics had no substance. It was a matter of emotion. It was a matter of personal feeling. And if that's all ethics is, there's no ability to have an argument. Because it's just your feeling and my feeling. It's when I look at something, I go, yep, that's what happened. Ugh, I don't like it. That's my moral judgment. That's all moral judgments were in the time that Michael was writing the first version of his book. My point is that all of us have a personal responsibility here to educate ourselves on non-vacuous morality. What Walzer is talking about is a vacuous morality. It might as well not exist. And in that kind of world, you and I or any two people cannot even have a moral argument because we don't share any conception. Now, I'm not arguing for universal morality, but it's a lot more than ugh. The second point I'd make is that each of us, as we develop, has to commit ourselves to some set of values. If you don't, you end up like John Dean in Watergate, blind ambition, or blind obedience. The kinds of life you or I, or that you want to live, are based upon the values that you grab for yourself. So we can look at it from a historical standpoint, but it gets right down, that's part of why I write the book, it gets down to people, individual leaders, and the values and morality that they have integrated into their life, not as something separate. Now I'm going to make a managerial decision, okay, now I'm done with that, and I'm going to make a moral decision. These things are integrated into your life, just like every other dimension of your life is integrated. So you didn't ask that question, but I felt like I had an answer, so I
And to turn it back a bit to what Father Hehir began with, in order to make good decisions as citizens, moral decisions, we need to insist upon a measure of transparency so that we can make judgments based on real facts as best as we can know them. So we have room for maybe one more question. Would you like to take it?
Hi, my name is Peggy Pianchi. I'm a clinician. I work with veterans and service members. And things are pretty emotional politically at this time. And I hear from service members and their families about, you guys are talking about morality and feelings of us versus that type of thing. But in this political climate with the two people that we have running for President of the United States, a few months back we heard about one of the candidates talking about possibly violating Geneva Conventions with going after potential terrorists, their families, their children, that type of thing. Could you maybe address the responsibility of service members who are active duty, who are retired, and their civilian family members, and even the community at large, their morality and principles may be attached to those types of statements, because there's been some talk on the radio a few months back when Donald Trump was mentioning this type of thing. And since we're talking about morality, maybe we could bring that up.
Well, there was a strong reaction, strong counter-reaction to that among retired civilian and military professionals. I know for a fact, though not public, there was a strong reaction on the active duty side of civil and military leaders. Though not public, and it shouldn't be public. Now, when I'm on active duty, I serve the nation. I don't serve the fifth estate. And my criticisms are necessarily behind the curtain of my position. But that, I think, was a very good example, because you didn't hear much about that after initially said, where there were a lot of civil and military senior people who kind of said, well, that's not quite right. And I think that speaks well of both the civil and military security specialists to be able to have that kind of reaction. I don't know if it got to exactly, I thought you were going to ask a different question.
Yeah, and you, sir?
No, I agree. That was an easy question.
We are, what's that?
One more?
Okay, yeah, Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Wazzy. I just was wondering, how do you see the state of the protocols and the thinking relative to the use of drones, drone warfare now?
We'll end with an easy question.
Well, I'll start with two angles, and I'm sure that you'll get a couple of comments. First, I think in many ways, the protocols put in place by the current administration are well beyond the requirement of just warfare. That they are, the administration has gone to great lengths, and I'm not saying perfect lengths, but great lengths, to make sure that the target is a legitimate target. That they aim narrowly at that target within much they possibly can. That the possibility of innocence is almost a veto on the strike, which is well beyond what the principle of double effect requires. And they have a very rigorous process to tee up these targets. Now, there are lots of other problems with this. So I'll argue on the good side, and I'll argue on the not so good side. The principle of due care to innocence and due risk to the combatants is a real tough one to apply to drones. When you're flying a drone from Nevada, or you're flying it from some other place, and your risk is to your wrist, and you're risking the lives of civilians, that's a real tough one to call. Have is it still proportionate? Probably so. If you want to risk a pilot, drop a 500-pound bomb, you risk the pilot, but you have more collateral damage. So there's some trade-offs in the proportionality. There's also problems in defining combatants. And I don't know if the administration has gone back to revisit this, but at one point, the definition of a combatant was any military age male above the age of blank. That seemed to me a pretty wide definition. And if you were 19 and killed on the target, you were de facto a legitimate target. So I think there have been pluses and minuses I think many more pluses than minuses. On the moral side, on the prudential side though, which many people bring up and say, look, we're killing bad guys, but we're creating more bad guys than we're killing. That's not really an issue of proportionality or double effect. That's an issue of strategic prudence. And I think there's a good argument there.
I'm sure you both want to jump into.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that question. One of my jobs in the White House was to be one of the decision people on drone strikes in the Bush administration, which actually had a tighter standard than the Obama administration. So it's unlike the questions that my two colleagues have gotten, where they actually have expertise on. I have a lot of expertise on this, but I'm actually going to take a step back, and I'm going to go to my favorite movie about all of this, which is A Few Good Men, where at one point Jack Nicholson, playing the Marine Colonel, I don't know if some of you have seen this, says you can't deal with the truth, or words to that effect. The problem with drones has nothing to do with the drone itself. The problem with drones has to do with the underlying philosophical, moral issues we're talking about tonight, which is modern societies have a very hard time dealing with violence. We're not using the drones as part of our response to the Chinese in the South China Sea or anything else. Who are we using the drones against? We're using them against the people who took us down on 9/11. Extremely horrendous attack where overall the support of the American people, in fact, is typically much higher than the administration. It wants the administration to take more action. We see this all the time in polls against terrorists, if not against anybody else. And yet there is this understandable concern about this. The taste that it leaves in our mouths in waging war of any sort, taking lives. So therefore, drones get instrumentalized because it's easier to instrumentalize them. It's the things of, and I always, this idea that, well, it's somehow immoral because it's some guy in Nevada rather than a guy flying over it. But, I mean, most of my near-death experiences in war have been some guy sitting in a garage pushing a, cell phone button and either shooting off a rocket 20 kilometers or, setting off a IED or something, a roadside bomb some distance away, who is bearing almost no risk, him or herself in rare cases. And so I don't feel that, so I don't see that as an argument. There's one interesting thing about drones, though, from a diplomatic standpoint. I really haven't reflected much on my diplomatic career, but here's the interesting thing about drones. And this is how diplomacy works for real in the world, not with the ICC. Sorry, I can't help myself with the ICC. That's the one button, all right. But a drone is not an invasion because there's nobody in it. Countries are understandably very protective of their sovereignty. The F-16 pilot is wearing an American flag on her shoulder, and she's got dog tags. She is a one lady, or it'll usually be at least two aircraft, a two American soldier invasion of that country. Even if that country is happy that, Abu al-Wadi was finally taken out because they couldn't take him out or they didn't want to take him out, but it doesn't matter. It was an invasion. They have to deal with it. A drone is kind of like one of those satellites that have been going overhead, except this one, every once in a while, goes down and takes somebody out. In other words, it's politically easier for us to do a drone strike in a friendly nation that that the very fact of doing these things is very complicated than it is to use aircraft. Plus, if the pilots, if the plane develops engine trouble, it goes down, it's just all kinds of other complications. So that makes drones convenient. Now that opens up all kinds of practical management decisions that are covered in chapter 6 of this book very, very well. But the underlying point, whenever the drone subject comes up, is it's not about drones. It's about, is it right to kill people? From afar, even if you know you've gone through the decision tree, and that's what we went through in every case, these people are engaged in activities designed deliberately to kill Americans or our allies. And even then, there's concern about it.
A couple of things. First of all, if you want to see applied ethics done well, then read Professor Ken Hymes's book on drones. It's a very, very sophisticated treatment of both the factual and normative dimensions of it. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think, that there's no question, I think, that by focusing on the instrument, you can get too narrow a view of this question. Do drones have a chance to be more precise than coming in at 600 miles an hour in an F-16 or better? Yeah, they can be more precise. Actually, my sense about the drone question is that all the concentration is on use in battle, in using these drones. My question is use ad bellum. Is the field of battle anywhere we want it to be? Is the field of battle any place we decide that there's even a remote danger to our interests? That's a very difficult question but it's also a very different and necessary question in an era of transnational actors that you simply self-define the world as the field of battle. Immediately after 9/11, the US government said there were threats within 60 nations. If you say that out loud, and it seems to imply you're ready to go after 60 nations, you're fighting terrorism and you're going to be seen as a terrorist. Because you can't just declare 60 nations open to attack. So it seems to me it takes a lot more attention to jus ad bellum, the right to use them, where you use them, under what conditions, than only by concentrating on this instrumentality, which has both positive and negative dimensions to it. And the final point, as Jim has raised, is the interesting thing about the post-9/11 world, particularly, is that the killing of civilians is not only a moral problem, it can be your biggest political problem, too. It can create the lack of legitimacy, to use Jim's principle, in terms of what you're trying to do. So it is that broader sense that I think drones need to be examined.
You know, the issue you raised, Father, about theaters of war is really getting to be much more difficult in the era of transnational actors, in the era of the information age and remote possibilities of using force. This is something that is going to, I think, deserve a lot of very precise study.
That's the answer.
Well, as you can tell, we're just getting warmed up here at the 90-minute mark, and that's a sign of a good conversation, that it leaves you wanting more. I hope that you'll carry this conversation outward. I want to mention, first of all, that copies of General Dubik's book will be available for sale out the back door there in the hallway, and I hope that many of you will pick up copies and read it closely. But lastly, please join me in taking a moment to thank our terrific speakers.